Today I thought I'd do an ownership review of my Aston Martin V8 Vantage S, which I've had for a year now. And I love this car. But the thing about my ownership reviews, if you're a subscriber of the channel, you'll know that I'm quite negative about the car in general, the cars in general, because I assume you've seen all the hyped videos. The thing about journalists and YouTubers that get these press cars is that they hype it up so much because they want to get the next car from that dealership or manufacturer or press team or whatever. So they don't really want to be too negative about the car if they don't like it. So I quite like seeing where people really put their money. That's the most telling thing. Where are they putting their money? So I don't like the reviews which are just a press car or a loan car. So I aim for the ownership reviews. The very best reviews are somebody who sold the car. They're the people that really tell you the truth about the car because they've already sold it. They've got their money out of it. But you're going to have to make do with my ownership review, which I'm going to be as truthful as I possibly can about this car. And I'm going to describe how it feels, but also who this car is for. And to see if you are the type of person where you'd enjoy owning this car. I'm starting on a extreme negative, which might not apply to everybody, but around town, I detest this car. And I'm only starting it because I'm going around town now in a 20-mile-an-hour zone. So naturally, it's on my mind. And it actually puts me off using this car because I thought that the Sportshift gearbox would be better around town than the manual because you don't have to press the clutch in. And that's what people said. You know, if you're in central London, you don't have to hold the clutch down when you're stuck in traffic and ride the clutch, etc. And I think it's the opposite. This car is better when it's up to speed with this gearbox, and it's crap when it's around town. And that's because, firstly, it doesn't give you second gear unless you're well up into the revs above 2,500 RPM, which if I go to 2,500 RPM now, it's quite loud and there's a lot of engine braking, like it's ready to go. So it's hard to do casual driving with the Sportshift gearbox around town, whereas a manual, you can force it into second. Secondly, stop starting is a nightmare because this only applies to first gear. But if you're going like 5 to 10 miles an hour, the car doesn't know whether you're going to come to a complete stop or if you're just slowing down and the lights have turned green and you're off again. Because it's got to engage and disengage the clutch itself, and it doesn't know what's happening ahead of you. So it doesn't release the clutch until the very last minute, which means you're kind of feel like you're being thrown into the car in front. What I do personally, and I've got a full video on the Sportshift gearbox if you want to check that out on the channel. But what I do is if I know I'm coming to a complete stop, I'll press both paddles and it will put it into neutral and I'll just roll up to it. And then if we're off again, then I'll press the right paddle and it selects the gear again and we go. For me, that's the smoothest way of driving. You can't really just have it in second and first and just let it do its thing and drop down itself. It doesn't get it. Overall, this is quite a heavy analog car to drive. It's quite a heavy feeling car. It's a very muscle car type of feeling. So when you're driving along, there's a lot to think about. The steering's relatively heavy and it doesn't give you much confidence. I'm personally something that I've discovered recently about myself is I prefer cars that feel quite light on their feet. I like them to feel analog, but I do like them to feel quite easy and zippy and fun to drive. Whereas this car is for someone who more prefers like that you're driving this kind of like powerful, analog, unrefined beast. And I see lots of quite like older men driving these cars, and I think, why did you choose that car? It's hard work. It's a hard work car to drive. So it's far from relaxing, especially with the suspension. This is the S suspension, and if I had the budget, I would see if I could change to some kind of adaptable damper setup that quite a few specialists offer now, because it's quite bouncy when you're up to speed. It's not one of those cars where it just absorbs the bumps and you feel quite confident going fast in it. This car needs a smooth road. It needs, Swiss, Italian, Spanish roads to be able to really get the most out of it. The seats also don't give you much confidence in driving it fast either. So there isn't a lot of lumbar support in it. And I don't know what it is, but I just can't get on with the seats. I can never find the right driving position. So it's quite difficult from the start to actually have confidence in this car, because the chassis doesn't communicate that much to you when you're driving spiritedly. You can't take it down British B roads or anything that is less than smooth, because it doesn't fill you with much confidence. And that brings me on to my main point of how this car makes you feel. And I hate it when you watch an Aston Martin review and they talk about James Bond. It's the lamest thing. And personally, for the manufacturer, I think needs to potentially distance themselves a little bit, or just drop this James Bond thing. Like, every car has a James Bond edition, a 007 edition. You've got the DBS with the Her Majesty's Secret Service edition. And you got the DB11 with the 007 edition, the DB9 with the 007 edition, and none of those cars were in a Bond film. So it's just marketing. It's kind of just annoying. However, on that subject, I will use Daniel Craig's James Bond to describe what this car is like to drive. Because the thing about Daniel Craig and how he portrayed James Bond is very unrefined, ham-fisted, takes gambles, has complete faith in his own ability, and he is able to do things and achieve things that nobody else would dare to do. And he's quite ruthless with it. And that's what you need to be like when you're driving this car. Because when you throw this car into a bend, you're on your own. It doesn't communicate much to you. It's quite heavy. And as you own the car, you go, well, I'll take it a little bit faster. And the car does it. The car achieves it. And the car has way more grip and ability than what it makes you think. Whereas some cars, they don't really extract much of your driving ability. They just kind of flatter your driving ability. Whereas this car, it's kind of saying, no, you're going to need all of your confidence and all of your driving ability to be able to get the most out of this car. We're not going to help you. And it takes someone like Daniel Craig to get the most out of this car, because you've got to blindly trust it. And it will perform for you. But you've really got to gel with it. And I do think changing the seats would make somewhat of a difference. So when you're going around a corner, you and the passenger aren't kind of tightening your core and holding yourself in while you're trying to concentrate on getting around the corner as efficiently as possible. This is in the S, it's the quicker steering rack. It's actually a smaller wheel than you expect. In pictures, it looked big. I think it's like the lack of buttons on the wheel itself. And it just looks like a dinner plate, someone once said. And that makes you think it's going to be big. But when you get it in your hands, it's actually quite small. But it's the faster steering rack as well, which this is the faster one. God knows what the slower one is like, because it is not a fast rack, which is one of the reasons why I'd get the S. In fact, if I had the choice to go for the S and non-S, again, I probably would still go for the S, because you've got the louder exhaust, you've got the nicer stitching, I quite like the carbon fiber, and there's a few more like black bits on here instead of the silver. I like that. The compromise is the suspension, which, as I say, I'm about to go over some rail tracks now, and it's very bumpy. And I'd say that's the only downside to getting the S. The more power, I don't really notice or anything like that. It just looks a bit cooler. It's a nicer spec. So on the subject of the gearbox, it's very fun to use when you're up and running. I like it. It's the stop-starting that's annoying. But when you're actually using it, I enjoy it. I would get a Sportshift again because it's engaging. But I've never driven a manual, but I've sat in one, and the gear lever is like a little bit far back. It's a bit strange, and the clutch is quite heavy. And I think I prefer the Sportshift. And to drive a Sportshift, you don't need to lift if you are just feathering the throttle and maintaining speed. And you don't need to lift if you're flooring the car and it's going up into the high revs. It will actually do a very, very fast shift in the high revs, or if you're flooring the car. Almost DCT-like. It is when you are gradually accelerating and you change up. That's when you need to lift, because otherwise it will lurch. So once you understand that, it becomes a very engaging car to drive. And I liken it to if you're sat on a plane or a train and you're bored and you decide to like get up one of those games that you play on your phone, whether it's like a game of darts or there's those like timing games where you got to press it at the right time. It's like that. So when it's a game of darts on your phone, you have to press it at the exact right time, and it feels really rewarding when you nail it. This car's like that. So it becomes quite addictive because every shift is different depending on your timing, depending on the speed of the car, the throttle input, which means that it's actually quite addictive because you're like, ooh, that was a good one. That wasn't such a good one. Oh, I should have done that this time. I shouldn't have dropped into second. I should have dropped into second, or whatever. There's so much to it. I quite like that. There is a variation in the shifts, and you are still in control of what's a good shift and what's not a good shift. So I think from what I've said, you kind of get an idea of what you're getting with this car. You're getting a muscle car that feels heavy, and it sounds incredible, and it makes you feel good. And if you want the perfect gearbox, if you want the perfect handling, then go and buy a BMW M2. They're great. I found that M2 to be quite boring around town, but once you got it up to speed, it was quite fun on the B roads. Again, quite harsh suspension though. Alternatives to this car really are things like the Porsche 911, Lotus Evora, Lotus Emira, and it all just depends on what you want, because this car, none of the others offer it, that kind of like what they call a brute in a suit. And I think brute in a suit is quite a good analogy for this car, because I said in a previous video, it's like wearing your best suit, like a suit you would wear for a wedding all of the time when you're driving it, because it's not, you look your best in it. It's not practical. You can't perform at your best in it physically, but it makes you feel good. And people look at you in it. I'm not used to that. I'm not used to people looking at me in the car that I'm driving. And the cars that I normally drive, when people look, they know the car and they are car people. Whereas this, you get non-car people who take an interest in it. If that's going to bother you, then this isn't the car for you, because it does just get attention from kind of like people who are dreaming of owning one of these because of James Bond. I also think what makes this car feel special is just generally the interior as well. Let's start with that key though. I thought the key was cool at the start, but now I hate it. I wish it was just something that would go on my keychain, and it was either keyless or would actually just have a ring where you could put the rest of your keys and push it in like you do on like BMWs of this era, because it feels fantastic when you're pushing it in and you're completing that Aston Martin logo. But all of the rest of the time, it sucks, because you've got like a little pouch to put it in, and I bought another one because it went on my key ring. It was like £7 on eBay. And every time, like, say you get out the car and you're like, oh, I've left something in the car. You've got to get it out the little pouch, unlock, but then you've got the key in one hand, the pouch in the other. So you've got to put it back in the pouch or move to your other hand. And then you get the thing, which is now in your hands. So you've got to put that somewhere, and then you've got to get the key, lock it again, put it back in the pouch, but you know, you've got something else in your hand, and it just gets annoying. So that's one thing that annoys me, that I didn't think would annoy me, but just over time it has. Something I love is these dials. I think the dials that you're using, I can't believe that only one manufacturer puts that much thought and design into dials these days, because from kind of like 2010 onwards, we stopped caring. It was like the 1980s went to like plasticky stuff, and then we just stopped there. And it was only Aston Martin really that continued putting effort into making it look like jewelry. And I think that's really cool. The only downside is like 80 miles an hour is like only 20% the way around the speedo, which is really weird. So you never use the speedometer, the analog one. You only use the digital one ever anyway. So it's just there for kind of like aesthetic, to be honest. I watched a JM on Cars video, and he said that he regretted putting Apple CarPlay into his car. And I can see that, because at the moment I just keep the screen down and that's it. And I have a thing that I got from Amazon, a Bluetooth thing, and it streams my music perfectly. This is the best sound system I've ever heard in a car. I think it's made by Alpine. It's not the Bang & Olufsen upgrade. If you are looking for a car and you're deciding whether you want the Bang & Olufsen upgrade, whether you're going to pay a bit more for a car that has it, don't. You really don't need it. The only downside to it is this. The on and off button on the radio is the play pause button, which means that if you switch the radio on, it will play whichever the last thing you played on your phone. So I've got an iPhone, and it will play my iTunes purchases. So the same song comes on every single time if it's on. So you have to remember and get into the habit of switching the radio on and off when you don't need it. Some people complain about the Volvo parts and the Ford parts bin stuff. I don't care about that. I think that's a very weird thing for people to get obsessed about, and I think that comes down to the same thing as what the journalists have to say about the car when it first comes out. But if you drive a BMW 7 Series or even like a new Rolls Royce, you're going to get parts from a cheaper BMW. If you buy a 7 Series, it's going to have parts in it that are shared with a 1 Series. So just because this is from a Volvo or Ford doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad. And the things that are shared, you barely ever touch it. The window switches, the mirror switches, and things like that. So why do you care? And in this day and age, the sat-nav, you're never going to use it anyway. Even if it was the latest up-to-date thing that you can buy, you're just going to want to use Apple CarPlay anyway. So I don't really know why you feel the need to worry about that. I like the general fascia because I thought this looked cluttered compared to the haptic dash version that came later, but I actually quite like the way this looks and the feel of the knobs. And when you push something, it's quite tight. You have to put some effort into pushing the buttons. They're not as light and flimsy as they look. And the aluminium pieces are really nice to touch. They're always like ice cold when you touch them, which is really nice. So interior wise, I do actually really like this car. There's tons of storage space. You've got the shelf at the back here, and you've got a full hatch. So it seems to me like the convertibles are cheaper than the coupes at the moment. Random, normally it's the other way around, but hey ho. While I remember my lights are on all the time, I was told to do that because the heat stops the condensation and means that they don't get damaged. The LEDs don't get like condensation in them and then get water damage and that kind of thing. So I always have my lights on. However, if your battery ever goes flat, don't jump start the car with the lights on. Switch the lights off. Try to charge the car. Don't jump it, because I blew my LED lights jump starting the car, which was very expensive. I had to get the LEDs repaired, and yeah, really annoying. So if you buy one of these cars, remember that. So when you're cross shopping for this car, there's not much else available that's like it. What, like a TVR? A manual TVR is quite an analog car. But a 911 is a lot lighter on its feet. It's a lot zippier. Has a lot more space, rear engined. And it's hard to cross shop because I don't know your budget of what you're looking at, because you could be thinking about buying one for 20 grand and you could be thinking about buying one for 60 grand. They range so much that they can't be compared like for like with every single car between 20 grand and 60 grand. But having said that, given this car, given what I've experienced with this car, I wouldn't pay over 40 grand for one. I think that's about right, because you're going to get a very good one. I don't think you need the haptic dash. I don't like the wheels on the facelift with the haptic dash, but I prefer the look of the haptic dash. But apart from that, I would rather have a budget for a lighter flywheel modification and just general upgrades and maintenance budget set aside than spend all of your money on one to, like, from a main dealer or something like that. I wouldn't spend 60 grand on one. I wouldn't spend 50 grand on one. I don't think they're worth that. I think when you get into that price bracket, you're starting to get a lot better cars coming into your budget. Because when you get into that like 60 grand price bracket, you're now talking like 991.2 Porsche 911s. You could potentially get the next Vantage along if that's kind of what you want. I've driven one of those on track. Didn't really give me much emotion, but it might be something for you. You're getting into the realms of Maserati, MC Stradale, Ferrari 360 Modernas, anything you want. There's just so much other choice. But below 40 grand, not much has this much presence. Not much is going to give you that feeling of driving something special. And if you're someone who cares about people appreciating your car or looking at you or admiring you when you're filling it up with fuel or something, then for the money, this is going to give you the most of that. If you like people thinking like you've done well for yourself. I'm someone who I don't really care. I like it when other car people appreciate my purchase or my decision, but I don't really want random strangers to think I've done well for myself. I don't get a kick from that. So hopefully that gives you an idea of if this car is for you. if you're the type of person that's going to enjoy this car. If you have any questions, just drop me a comment on this video. If you're cross-shopping it with something and you're not really sure whether to get this or a V8 Vantage, then drop it in the comments. I might have driven it. I might be able to give you some insight. Apart from that, subscribe if you want more videos like this, and drop it a like if it's been useful, and I'll see you in the next video.